I've been digging holes in Pinewood Cemetery for 41 years, and I can tell you that every mistake you can imagine with a burial has happened at least once. Wrong plot, wrong name on the marker, caskets delivered to the wrong service. I've seen families screaming at each other over who gets the prime spot under the oak tree. Watched groundskeepers accidentally clip water lines and flood entire sections. After 4 decades, you develop a kind of numbness to it all. The dead don't care about our errors. It's the living who make everything complicated. The morning they asked me to dig up plot 318, I was already thinking about my retirement in 8 months. My knees ached in the cold, and the backhoe's hydraulics had been making a grinding noise that maintenance kept promising to fix. It was a standard exhumation. The Murphy family wanted to relocate Frank Murphy's remains to Colorado, where his daughter had settled. 7 years in the ground meant the casket would likely be intact, but compromised. I'd done maybe 200 exhumations in my career, routine work, if deeply unpleasant. I started at 6:30 in the morning, before the November sun could burn off the fog that settled thick between the headstones. Plot 318 was in Section C, near the eastern fence where the old maples dropped their leaves in dense, rotting piles. Frank Murphy's headstone was modest granite. Nothing fancy. Born 1944, died 2018. Beloved father and husband. I checked my paperwork twice, confirmed the plot number with Timothy Cross, the cemetery director, who'd been hovering around me with unusual nervousness since I arrived. "Everything in order?" Timothy asked, adjusting his tie even though he was wearing a practical work jacket over it. "Should be," I said, climbing into the backhoe. "Same as always." But it wasn't the same. At 4 feet down, my bucket hit something that shouldn't have been there. The distinctive sound of steel on steel echoed up from the hole, and I shut off the engine. Timothy was on his phone, pacing near his truck, so I grabbed a shovel and climbed down into the excavation. The soil was dark and heavy with clay, the smell of disturbed earth thick in my nostrils. I scraped away the dirt carefully, revealing the concrete vault that held Frank Murphy's casket. Standard procedure. But beneath it, maybe 6 inches below where the vault should have ended, my shovel struck something else. Another vault. I stood there in the hole, my breath forming clouds in the cold air, staring at what I was seeing. 2 vaults, stacked, in a single plot. "Timothy," I called up, "you need to see this." He came to the edge, looked down, and went pale. "That's not possible." "Well, it's here." We spent the next hour carefully excavating both vaults, calling in additional help. By 9 a.m., we had both exposed, Frank Murphy's on top and below it, a second vault with a nameplate that read Karen Sloan, died 2016. My hands were shaking as I brushed the dirt from her nameplate, not from cold but from the wrongness of it. 2 families, 2 burials, same plot, and no one had noticed. Timothy was on the phone with lawyers before we even opened the vaults. The Murphy family arrived first. Derek Murphy, Frank's son, a trim man in his 40s, with graying temples and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept well in years. Then came Valerie Sloan, Karen's sister, a woman with short silver hair and a rigid posture that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer will. "I visit my sister every Wednesday," Valerie said, her voice tight. "Every single Wednesday for 9 years. You're telling me there was someone else buried on top of her?" Timothy nodded miserably. "We're investigating how this happened. Our records show—" "Your records are worth nothing," Derek interrupted. "I want to know what condition my father is in." That's when we opened the vaults. I've seen decomposition in every stage. I've seen caskets that held together and caskets that collapsed into splinters. I've seen remains that were pristine and remains that were barely recognizable. But I had never seen anything like what was inside those caskets. Frank Murphy's casket was on top, and when we lifted the lid, his skeleton was there, dressed in the suit he'd been buried in, the fabric discolored but intact. But woven through his bones, impossibly integrated with his remains, were additional bones that could only have come from below. Karen Sloan's bones. Her femur was locked around his, not beside it but somehow fused, as if the bone had grown through his in a lattice of calcium and decay. Their spines curved together, vertebrae merged in ways that made no anatomical sense, and their skulls pressed temple to temple, as though they'd turned toward each other in the darkness. Valerie made a sound I'll never forget, something between a gasp and a sob. Derek just stared, his face completely blank. Get them out, Timothy whispered. Get them both out. Now. We brought in Dr. Alicia Brennan, a forensic pathologist from the county medical examiner's office. She arrived by noon, her equipment loaded in the back of a white van, her expression professionally neutral until she saw the remains. Then she crouched beside the caskets for a long time, saying nothing, just examining the impossible fusion of bone. This isn't possible, she finally said. Bone doesn't do this. Not after death. Not ever. But it did, I said. She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I recognized, the same thing I felt crawling under my skin. Fear of the inexplicable. Over the next week, the investigation expanded in ways none of us anticipated. Timothy discovered that the cemetery's records had been deliberately falsified years ago. Plot 318 listed separately in 2 different ledgers, sold to 2 different families. But more disturbing was what Derek and Valerie uncovered about their loved ones' deaths. Frank Murphy died in St. Catherine's Hospital on March 14, 2018, in room 447. Karen Sloan died in the same hospital, in the same room, on March 14, 2011. Exactly 7 years earlier, within 2 hours of the same time of day, both deaths had been sudden, unexpected. Both had been handled by the same hospital administrator, a man named Gregory Vance, who'd processed their paperwork, contacted their families, arranged everything with unusual efficiency. Gregory Vance disappeared in 2019. His house was abandoned, his car found at a long-term parking lot at the airport. No trace. Dr. Brennan's autopsy findings came back 3 weeks later. Both Frank and Karen had been poisoned with the same compound, a rare alkaloid derivative that wouldn't show up in standard toxicology screens. It would have caused respiratory failure, mimicking natural death. Someone had murdered them, 7 years apart, in the same room, and then arranged for them to be buried in the same grave. But the bone fusion, that remained unexplained. Dr. Brennan wrote in her report that the merger appeared to have occurred gradually over the 7 years after Frank's burial, the skeletal structures somehow drawn together, intertwining through 6 feet of earth and 2 sealed caskets. She had no mechanism to explain it. No precedent in medical literature. Nothing. I was there the day they finally separated the remains, carefully documenting each bone, trying to return Frank Murphy and Karen Sloan to their individual identities. It took 2 forensic teams working for 6 hours. Some of the bones had fused so completely, they had to be carefully sawed apart, leaving marks that would be forever visible in both skeletons. I'm retiring in 3 months now. I've stopped sleeping well, because late at night, I keep thinking about Plot 318. About the years those 2 strangers spent in the ground together, their bones reaching for each other in the dark. I think about Gregory Vance, wherever he is, and what he knew about Frank Murphy and Karen Sloan that made him kill them 7 years apart and bury them together. And I think about the question no one wants to ask: were they reaching for each other, or was something else down there in the earth pulling them together? I don't go near Section C anymore. Sometimes, early in the morning when the fog is thick, I can see other workers standing near Plot 318, just staring down at the empty ground. They don't say anything, neither do I. But we all know we're wondering the same thing. How many other graves in Pinewood Cemetery aren't what they seem? How many other plots hold secrets we haven't excavated yet? I've been digging holes for 41 years. I thought I knew what to expect from the dead. I was wrong.
Hello, YouTube family. Thanks for watching. Big love to our subscribers. You keep this channel alive. Only about 20% of viewers are subscribed, so if you enjoy the chills, hit that subscribe button. It's quick, it helps a ton, and it means more stories coming your way. See you in the next one, if you dare.
I'm writing this because I need someone to know what I found, even if no one believes it. I've been digging graves at Sunset Hills Cemetery for 19 years, and I've always prided myself on precision. Numbers, measurements, plot coordinates. These things matter when you're dealing with the dead. They deserve accuracy. But 3 weeks ago, I learned that sometimes precision isn't enough to protect you from what shouldn't be possible. The state ordered the exhumation of Janet Carmichael on a Tuesday morning in late September. Criminal investigation, they said, potential poisoning case being reopened. I'd done maybe 50 exhumations in my career, and they're never pleasant, but they're straightforward work. You verify the plot number, check it against your maps, dig carefully, document everything. I'm good at my job because I'm methodical. I don't make mistakes with numbers. Plot 156 was in Section F, near the western edge where the morning light comes in, slanted through the birch trees. I arrived at 6:15, before the dew had burned off, and spent 20 minutes double-checking my coordinates with the cemetery database. Everything matched. Plot 156, Janet Marie Carmichael, buried April 2022. The headstone was simple black granite, her name and dates etched cleanly. Born 1978, died 2022. Beloved wife and mother. But something felt wrong immediately, and it took me a while to identify what. The flowers were fresh. Not just recent, fresh, carnations and white roses in a glass vase. The water still clear, the stems showing no signs of wilting. Someone had been here within the last day or two. For a grave that was part of a criminal investigation, for a woman whose family should have been notified not to disturb the site, that seemed odd. I called Abigail Cross, our GPS mapping specialist, to confirm the location before I started digging. She showed up 40 minutes later with her equipment, a tablet and a thermos of coffee that she drank without offering me any. Abigail was precise like me, maybe more so. She'd mapped every plot in Sunset Hills down to the centimeter. Plot 156, she confirmed, checking her tablet. You're in the right spot. Who's been leaving flowers? She frowned, scrolling through her records. Family's been visiting regularly. Husband comes every Sunday. Daughter visits on Thursdays. They were notified about the exhumation. 2 weeks ago, she looked at the fresh flowers, then back at her tablet. That's weird. I started digging at 7:30. The soil was still soft from recent rain, and the backhoe's bucket moved through it smoothly. At 4 feet down, I switched to hand tools, working carefully. The concrete burial vault came into view around 8:45, and I was brushing the dirt from its edges when Graham Carmichael arrived. He was a tall man, maybe late 40s, with thinning hair and a gray jacket that looked too warm for the weather. His face had the worn quality of someone who'd been grieving for a long time. "You're digging up my wife," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir. State ordered it." "I'm sorry for your loss." He stood there watching me work, his hands in his pockets, and after a few minutes he said, "This isn't where we buried her." I stopped, my shovel halfway into the dirt. "Sir? This isn't the plot. We buried Janet in plot 165, over there." He pointed east toward a section about 50 yards away. I climbed out of the excavation and pulled up the cemetery map on my phone, showing him the records. Plot 156, sir. Janet Marie Carmichael. That's what the state asked me to exhume, and that's what our records show. He stared at the map, then at the grave, then at me. I've been visiting plot 165 for 3 years. Every Sunday. That's where my wife is buried. Abigail walked over to where he'd pointed, her GPS unit in hand. I followed, leaving the excavation open behind me. Plot 165 was identical in every way, same section, same type of headstone, same black granite. But when we reached it, there was no headstone, just grass. Neat, undisturbed grass that looked like it had never been touched. "There's nothing here," Abigail said quietly, checking her tablet. "Plot 165 has never been used." Graham's face went pale. "I've been standing right here, every Sunday, 3 years. The headstone was right there. I brought flowers." He stopped, looking around like he'd lost something. "Where are the flowers?" We walked back to plot 156, where I'd been digging. The fresh carnations and roses were still there in their glass vase, beaded with morning moisture. Graham stared at them for a long time. "Those are mine," he whispered. "I left those at plot 165 yesterday." I should have stopped then. I should have called someone, reported the discrepancy, waited for administrative clarity. But I'd already dug up the vault, and the state examiner was scheduled to arrive at noon, so I kept working, and Graham stayed, watching in silence as I exposed the full concrete vault and prepared to lift the lid. The casket inside was bronze, still intact, the seal unbroken, standard burial. But when we opened it, and I need you to understand that both Abigail and Graham were standing right there, they saw this too. Janet Carmichael was positioned wrong. Her head was where her feet should have been. She was facing down into the bottom of the casket, not up toward the lid. Her burial dress was on backward, the buttons running down her spine instead of her chest. Her hands were folded the wrong way, left over right, instead of right over left. "What is this?" Graham's voice cracked. "What did they do to her?" But it got worse. Tucked beside her body, wrapped in cloth, was a mirror, an antique hand mirror with a tarnished silver frame. I lifted it carefully, and when I turned it over, it didn't reflect the inside of the casket or the gray morning sky above us. It showed plot 165, the empty plot where Graham thought he'd been visiting, and in the reflection, I could see people. Graham, a younger woman who must have been his daughter, both of them standing exactly where there was nothing but grass. They were wearing clothes from years ago, their faces frozen in grief, staring down at earth that held nothing. And standing between them, transparent as fog, was Janet Carmichael. She was moving in the mirror, even though the rest of the image was frozen. Her mouth was opening and closing, forming words I couldn't hear. "Is that?" Abigail started, but didn't finish. Graham reached for the mirror, and I let him take it. He stared at his own reflection, 3 years younger, standing at a grave that didn't exist, and his hand started shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "She's saying something," he whispered. We took photographs. Abigail documented everything with her equipment. I called the state examiner and the cemetery director. Luther Vance, a retired funeral director who'd worked Sunset Hills for 30 years, showed up an hour later and stood at the edge of the excavation, his face gray. "Nathan Phelps buried her," Luther said finally. "I trained him, good kid, but he had problems. Dyslexia, spatial disorientation issues. I should have caught it." His voice was hollow. "He died 2 years ago. Car accident. He was driving on the wrong side of the road." The state examiner arrived with a lip reader, someone who could analyze video footage. We'd recorded the mirror on Abigail's phone, that frozen reflection with Janet's transparent figure moving. The lip reader watched it 17 times, taking notes, and when she looked up, her face was pale. "She's saying the same thing, over and over," the lip reader told us. "I'm not where you think I am." They removed Janet's body that afternoon, positioned her correctly for reburial. The mirror went to the state forensics lab, though I heard later that it stopped showing anything unusual, just a normal reflection of whoever held it. Graham and his daughter attended the second funeral, at the correct plot this time, plot 156, where she'd been all along. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. For 3 years, Graham visited the wrong grave, plot 165, empty ground. And every flower he left there appeared, overnight, at plot 156 50 yards away, transposed, mirrored, as if the cemetery itself was trying to correct the error, trying to connect the living to the dead across space that had been measured wrong, documented wrong, executed wrong, by a man whose brain saw everything backward. I went back to plot 165 last week, late after the cemetery closed. I brought a shovel even though I had no authorization to dig. I needed to know if there was anything down there, any reason why that plot felt important. I dug 3 feet before I hit something hard. Not a vault. A mirror. Buried face up in the empty earth. And when I brushed the dirt away and looked into it, I saw myself. But I was standing at plot 156. I was standing 50 yards away from where I actually was. I filled the hole back in. I didn't tell anyone, but now, every grave I dig, I wonder if I'm putting the body where it should be or where it will be found. I wonder how many people are buried in mirror reverse, in plots that don't match the records, in locations that transpose overnight, while grieving families visit empty ground and never know their loved ones are reaching back from 50 yards away, mouthing warnings no one can hear. If you ever visit a grave and feel like something's off, like the location isn't quite where you remembered, don't dismiss it. Don't trust the records. Bring a mirror, hold it up and look at the reflection. Because sometimes the dead aren't where we buried them. Sometimes they're exactly opposite, positioned backward, trying to tell us that the world is marked wrong and we've been mourning in the wrong direction. I'm leaving Sunset Hills next week. 19 years is enough, but I think about that lip reader's translation every night. I'm not where you think I am. And I wonder how many voices are saying those same words. In graves all across this cemetery, in reflections no one thinks to check. I've been digging graves at Maplewood Memorial for 22 years, and in that time I've learned to read the ground like some people read faces. The way soil settles after a burial, how frost affects the earth in winter, the subtle shifts that happen as caskets and vaults compress under tons of clay and loam. It's not mystical. It's geology, physics, the predictable behavior of matter over time. I mention this because I need you to understand that I'm not the kind of person who jumps to supernatural explanations. I deal in dirt and mathematics, in the measurable world. But what I witnessed at Claire Dobson's grave has left me questioning everything I thought I understood about the ground beneath our feet. It started on a Thursday morning in early March, unseasonably warm for Connecticut, the kind of fall spring that melts the frost and turns cemetery grounds into muddy soup. I arrived at 6:30 to find a work order for an exhumation, plot 447 in Section G, Claire Elizabeth Dobson, deceased September 2023. The family had requested relocation, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the note attached from our cemetery director: family reports anomalous ground movement, verify condition before proceeding. Anomalous ground movement could mean a lot of things, most of them having to do with water tables or soil composition. I grabbed my measuring tools and headed out to Section G, where the older oak trees cast long shadows across the headstones. Claire Dobson's plot was easy to find. The grass was lusher there than anywhere else, an almost unnatural green that stood out against the dormant brown of early spring. Her headstone was simple gray granite. Born 1961, died 2023. The earth has no master, only partners. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just observing. And that's when I saw it. The ground moved. Not settled, not subsided. It rose. Maybe 2 inches. A gentle swell that lifted the grass and the scattered leaves on the surface held for about 3 seconds, then fell back down. I waited, counting silently. And at 7 seconds, it happened again. Rise, hold, fall. Rise, hold, fall. Like breathing. I've seen settling soil. I've seen frost heave. I've seen ground shift from underground water movement. This was none of those things. This was rhythmic, regular, organic. I crouched down and put my hand flat against the earth, and I felt it, the warmth first, then the movement, a gentle pulse that pushed against my palm, and then receded. The ground was warm, not sun-warmed, not ambient temperature. Body warm. I called Ivan North, a soil scientist I'd worked with on drainage projects. He showed up 90 minutes later with enough equipment to stock a lab, and he spent an hour taking readings while I watched the grave continue its steady rhythm. Rise, hold, fall. Every 7 seconds, exact as a metronome. This doesn't make sense, Ivan said finally, staring at his instruments. The soil temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 feet down, in March. Decomposition gases. I suggested, though I knew it was wrong. Decomposition doesn't create heat like this. And Claire had been buried for 18 months, well past the active decay stage. No. Ivan's voice was tight, and there's something else. My conductivity sensors are picking up what looks like electrical activity. Not geological, not from buried cables. It's distributed through the soil in a network pattern. Like, he stopped, looking uncomfortable. Like neural pathways. That's when Paige Dobson arrived. Claire's daughter, 29 years old, with her mother's sharp features and the kind of intense focus that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. She was also an environmental scientist, and she came prepared with her own testing equipment and a manila folder thick with papers. "You're seeing it too," she said, watching the ground breathe. "Not a question. Your mother was a scientist," I said carefully. "Environmental work?" Paige nodded, opening the folder. "Mycorrhizal networks. Symbiotic relationships between fungi and plant roots." But her later work, she pulled out a notebook, pages filled with dense handwriting and diagrams. She was working on something else. Integration. She called it conscious soil networking. The idea that organisms could merge with Earth systems, become part of the ground's communication network. "That's theoretical," Ivan said. But his voice lacked conviction. "I found these notes in her study 3 months ago. She'd been experimenting on herself." Paige's hands were shaking as she held out the notebook. She wanted to become part of it. The earth. She wanted to continue beyond death. To integrate. We started the exhumation that afternoon. I brought in 2 additional crew members, and we worked with unusual care, documenting everything. The earth around Claire's plot had a different texture than normal cemetery soil, spongy, almost flesh-like, with a warmth that increased as we dug deeper. At 4 feet down, we started finding them. Root structures, not tree roots, not any plant I recognized. They were pale, translucent, pulsing faintly with what looked like fluid movement, and they radiated out from Claire's vault in all directions. A network spreading through the cemetery grounds. Holly Patricia, a mycologist from the State University, arrived as we exposed the vault. She took samples of the root structures, her face growing increasingly pale as she examined them under a portable microscope. "These aren't fungal," she said. "They're not plant-based. The cellular structure it's human, or it was. It's like human tissue that's adapted to survive underground, to transport nutrients and information. I don't even know what to call this." We opened the vault at dusk. The concrete was warm to the touch, almost hot. And when we lifted the lid and exposed Claire Dobson's casket, I felt something I'd never experienced in 22 years of grave digging. I felt watched. Not by the people standing around the excavation, but by the ground itself, like the earth had eyes. The casket was sealed and intact. No signs of damage or intrusion. But when we opened it, what we found inside made Ivan step back so fast, he nearly fell into the excavation. Claire Dobson's body lay in her burial dress, hands folded across her chest, face peaceful. But she wasn't decomposed. She wasn't preserved either, not in any way I recognized. Her skin had a faint greenish tint, and there were fine filaments growing from her fingers. Her face, her entire body, the same pale, translucent structures we'd found in the soil, extending from her like she was rooted into the satin lining of her casket. And her chest was moving. Barely, just a slight rise and fall synchronized with the breathing of the earth above her. Rise, hold, fall, every 7 seconds. "She's not alive," Paige whispered, and I realized she had tears streaming down her face. Medical death was confirmed. Brain death. But she's not gone either. She's part of it now. Reverend Susan Atwood, our cemetery chaplain, stood at the edge of the excavation, her face grave. "What do we do?" she asked. "How do you bury someone who's already become the earth?" We called in medical examiners, forensic specialists, environmental agencies. They took samples, ran tests, documented everything. The official reports are careful and clinical. They describe unprecedented biological adaptation, post-mortem integration with soil microbiome, unexplained metabolic activity. But none of them can explain how a dead woman's body created a distributed circulatory system that extends through 40 acres of cemetery grounds. None of them can explain why the breathing synchronized with seasonal patterns. We documented it over the following months, faster in summer, slower in winter, as if Claire had become part of the Earth's own respiratory cycle. Ivan's instruments detected what he could only describe as consciousness distributed through the soil network, not centralized in Claire's body, but spread out, diffused through the entire system like a vast underground nervous system, and the network was still growing. We traced the root structures extending beyond Maplewood Memorial, out into the surrounding forest, connecting with natural mycorrhizal networks in ways that shouldn't be possible. Paige spent weeks going through her mother's research, trying to understand what Claire had done to herself in those final months before her death. The experiments, the preparations, the deliberate integration of her own tissue with soil samples, creating a symbiotic relationship that would survive beyond clinical death. Holly Patricia published a paper on the cellular structures, carefully avoiding any mention of their origin, describing them only as unprecedented biological adaptation. They reburied Claire in the end. What else could they do? But her grave still breathes. Rise, hold, fall. Every 7 seconds, year-round. A gentle pulse that you can feel if you stand there long enough. The grass around her plot stays green, even in winter. Other graves in Section G have started showing elevated soil temperatures. The network is spreading. I still work at Maplewood Memorial, but I've stopped digging new graves in Section G. I can't shake the feeling that the ground there is aware, that something distributed and vast is conscious beneath our feet. Sometimes, early in the morning, when the cemetery is empty, I walk past Claire's grave and I swear I can hear it, not with my ears, but with some deeper sense. A voice in the earth, not speaking but present, aware, watching through a million points of contact spread through the soil. Paige visits once a week. She stands at her mother's grave and touches the earth. And I've seen her smile sometimes like she's receiving a message the rest of us can't hear. She told me once that her mother didn't die. She transformed. That consciousness doesn't end. It just changes medium, spreads out, becomes something larger and more distributed than a single human body could ever be. I don't know if that's transcendence or something darker. I don't know if Claire Dobson found peace or if she's trapped in an endless cycle, breathing with the earth, unable to let go. All I know is that the ground at Maplewood Memorial is alive in a way it shouldn't be, and every time I dig a new grave, I wonder if I'm just preparing another plot for someone else to integrate with the network, to join whatever Claire has become beneath our feet. The earth has no master, only partners. That's what her headstone says. I used to think it was poetic. Now I think it was a warning, or maybe an invitation. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I can feel it, a pulse, a rhythm, like the entire earth is breathing in time, with something vast and aware and patient. And I wonder how deep the network goes, how far it's spread, how many others might be down there already, integrated and conscious and waiting. If you work with the earth, if you dig graves or plant gardens or touch the soil with your bare hands, pay attention to the temperature, pay attention to the texture. And if you ever feel a pulse, a rhythm that matches a human heartbeat, step back, step away, because some partnerships aren't meant for the living. I'll see you in the next one, if you dare. But me? I'm starting to think twice about where I walk, where I stand, and what might be reaching up through the earth beneath my feet. Patient and ancient and hungry for connection.